Sometimes it's easier not to ask the questions why, but to just do your job. I've left on that helicopter from Long Bien, Vietnam, to my first station assignment, which was the 36th Evacuation Hospital in the South China Sea. Now, when I got my orders, the first thing you do, of course, is you get your orders. They tell you where you're going to be assigned. There were 27 hospitals in Vietnam when I was there. And there were aid stations and where the troops often would go to an aid station on the battleground, on the field, close by, and they would transfer him to an evacuation hospital or a surgical hospital or the closest hospital given the nature of his wounds. So the 36th Evacuation Hospital was a typical evacuation hospital, which is 400 beds. Now, an evacuation hospital in a war zone is designed in such a way that the patients come in and they are triaged. And what triage means in a war zone is triage is different than in maybe a hospital here stateside. In a war zone, let's paint a picture. The helicopter comes in, let's say there are 8 patients, 8 wounded soldiers, 8 casualties in that helicopter. Let's say 2 of them have passed away, and they will go to graves registration, and graves registration will do its job to identify, and then the next step for those bodies to come home in a flag-draped casket. Say another patient on that helicopter has lost both legs, a battlefield amputation. The legs are gone from the battlefield, but he's still alive. And let's say the next patient has lost an arm, one limb. And of course, he has not gone into shock because the medics have done their battlefield work. They've done cut downs, they've put in IVs, they've done the tourniquets, they do all the things field corpsmen and medics do to save that life so that it can get on the helicopter and get into the emergency room, and triage will take place. Say the next guy has a bullet wound, a through and through, but it doesn't appear that it hit an organ because his vital signs are still. So you've got this picture. So they're all in the emergency room now. Well, triage is done by the nurses and the doctors, and they make an assessment, and they say, well, this guy has a wound that it's just going to take a half an hour in the operating room. So they take the least wounded first because they are salvageable and they will require the least resources that we have. Say we have limited resources, whether it's supplies or physicians and nurses. So we save those who are the most salvageable. The person who has both of his legs amputated, he may take 8 hours in the operating room, or 10 or more. And he would take all the resources of those physicians while all the other patients would be waiting and possibly near death. So triage is done to maximize the resources and save those that we can, but no patient was ever left alone. So the person who has the amputated limbs perhaps is going into shock and perhaps comatose and may not have long to live. And so there will be a nurse or a medic who stays with that patient and is with them, and so they do not die alone. But that's triage. Now, I did not work in the emergency room, so where did I work? Well, I was assigned, my military occupational specialty was surgical nursing, so that I was not in the operating room. That's another specialty. My job in my unit at this 400-bed evacuation hospital was to treat the soldiers on a ward who were wounded and who were coming back from surgery or about to go into surgery. So we prepared them for surgery, or we took care of them after surgery, or both. My unit was 66 beds, and when I walked into that Quonset-style hospital, Quonset huts are individual huts that would maximize about 66 beds, and every bed was full. And it was hot. It was probably about 105, 108 degrees, and there was no air conditioning. The air conditioning was in the operating room and in the intensive care unit. So there were fans blowing, and I walked into this unit, and it is overwhelming. And this is like, welcome to Vietnam. You are now in a war zone. This wasn't my nice, clean unit at Fort Lee, Virginia. And these wounds are fresh. They have just come from the battlefield. Or they have come from other hospitals to come to our unit because we may have more space and more resources to take care of these patients. So I am now there for about 5 months when I'm assigned to the burn unit. And it's Christmas Eve, 1968, and a village on Christmas Eve was bombed, napalm, and unfortunately there were children and people in this area. It was a church, and 55 burned children came into the burn unit within a few hours. So I was assigned there, and I worked there for about a month. And that's when I came to realize the horrors of war, that it's not just our soldiers who suffer and die, but it's thousands of the local civilians. And why the children? And it was hard. It was hard to see kids suffer and die due to our military intervention. So now I'm too beginning to question the war. Why are we here? What are we accomplishing? We, as soldiers, we ask questions. As soldiers, we do our job. It's our mission. And we do our nursing, or if you're an infantry officer, no matter what your job is, and what you have a job to do, and you have a mission, and you pull together and you do your job. And sometimes it's easier not to ask the questions why, but to just do your job. But then years later, you start to question. So after about a month on the burn unit, I knew that I could ask for a transfer. I had heard that once you were in some place for 6 months, you could go to the chief nurse and ask for a transfer. So I was in closer to the Delta, South Vietnam. You look at the map. It's wetter. It's the rice paddies. It's a little different kind of injuries and wounds that came to us from this area because there were a lot of tropical diseases, and there were water buffalo in those rice paddies, and they would gore and attack our soldiers. There were sea snakes that the soldiers would come for R&R and swim in the South China Sea and get bit by a sea snake. And all of a sudden now I'm not just taking care of injuries from weaponry, but tropical diseases, malaria, and the other injuries that happen that aren't from the crossfires of war. So I went to the chief nurse and I said, I want to go north. And she said, why would you want to go north? That's where the fighting is, closer to the fighting. And I said, well, I'm ready. I said, I think I have the skills, and I want to go where there's heavy fighting. And she said, well, I'll send you to Pleiku. And I had mentioned Pleiku. And I said, I know that it's close to the Cambodian border, and the 4th Infantry Division there is getting hit hard, and they're short of nurses there. And she said, yes, they are, and that's where I'll send you. Be careful what you ask for. I got on a helicopter and flew to Quy Nhon, spent the night in a nursing billets, and that was a long helicopter ride. That's all I can remember, from Quy Nhon over the jungle. So now I'm not in the rice paddies, I'm in the jungle of Vietnam. There's tigers and there's elephants in that jungle. And it's a different temperature, it's cooler, which was much better. But when I got to Pleiku, everything was orange and red. And I did not know anything about Agent Orange. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know they were defoliating the forests to make it easier for our soldiers to get through the forest, because they're using these big machetes out in the jungle, and they're just cutting down the weeds to get to where they need to go. And so we had this program of dumping a chemical with dioxin in it called Agent Orange. And so when I got to Pleiku, and the air base and the hospital base there, everything was dead. Well, it had been defoliated. So, but the 71st Evacuation Hospital was also a 400-bed evacuation hospital, and it was full. And we were taking heavy mass casualties frequently, but we were also under attack quite frequently. And once you're in a war zone, it doesn't take long to just get used to it. You get used to the sounds of the overhead helicopters coming in, and you hear that artillery hill off in this direction, and you hear the sounds of outgoing, huge, loud artillery weapons, but they're going out. But if there's incoming, you learn to attune yourself to the sounds. Your senses become very acute in a war zone. You know how close that sound is. You know if it's a rocket or mortar coming in, and there's going to be a thud real soon, and then there is, and then the next thing is shrapnel flying all over the place. That was Pleiku. It was very different from where I had just come from. And we were only a few kilometers from the Cambodian border. And the 4th Infantry Division was assigned there, and our patients were coming from Cambodia. Well, at the time, our president and the United States government now is lying to the American people about the number of casualties, about the war itself, and how the winning and the losing of it was based on body count. So troops had to count the number of bodies that were killed. How many of those dead bodies are the enemy, and how many of those dead bodies are American soldiers? And then there'd be these body counts that were sent back to the United States via the journalists and the press. And our president was saying that we are not in Cambodia. We, meaning the United States military, is not in Cambodia. Well, now my patients, not all of them, but many of them are coming into our hospitals, into my surgical unit, and I asked them where they were injured, and they would say, Cambodia, ma'am. So I did something in defiance, because, we did hear about the news. In Vietnam, we were hearing the news of the increasing protests, protesting the war, and the lies that the government was telling. And now they were lying about that we weren't. And I said, we are in Cambodia. Why aren't they telling the truth? Why are they lying to the American people? So on every single patient's record, if he said he was injured in Cambodia, I wrote on the record, injured in Cambodia, injured in Cambodia. And our commanding officer had told us that we were not to mention anywhere in any reporting that these troops were injured in Cambodia. And I thought, well, they can lie, but they can't force me to lie. And now I think my sense of the war is starting to change, and I want to know why my patients are suffering and dying. And I want to know why these Vietnamese innocent women, many of the women and children, were dying. And I wasn't getting any answers. But what you do when you're in the military, you do your job. And my job was to take care of those patients. And we took care of injured children and injured in the crossfires of war. So I'm going to take you back to Vietnam with you for a few minutes, and I'm going to share with you an experience of just one night in Vietnam. And I think this will help you understand what that whole year was like. And that is, I have several patients on ventilators, they have chest wounds. We call them sucking chest wounds. And when you have a chest wound, then the physicians insert chest tubes, and so that you can help with the breathing of the lungs and the ventilator and the tracheostomies that they had. And so they were connected to a ventilator with a trach, and they couldn't talk, and they were restless, and they were agitated. And of course, because they couldn't communicate with you, and they had high anxiety. The other patients in my unit had been severely injured and wounded, and in this particular unit there were 44 beds. So I am in my hooch, that's what we called where we lived, and I heard the air raid siren go on. When the air raid siren goes on, the red alert, that means incoming. And that means either run to the bunker or roll under your bed. That was our protection, our bed. So roll under the bed, get your helmet, get your flak jacket. But for me, it was my unit, and then I heard the incoming, and then I heard the helicopters coming, a gaggle of helicopters. When I say gaggle, what I mean is like a gaggle of geese. There's a lot of them. So now the choppers are coming in consistently, and then a Chinook helicopter, which is really loud. I knew it wasn't a Huey, it was a Chinook, and I thought, this is bad. What does that mean? It means there's a lot of wounded in that Chinook helicopter. So I ran to my ward, and now I've got my helmet on, I'm wearing my flak jacket, and I'm ready to go to work. And all hell breaks loose. And several of our wards have been hit by rockets, and I've got all my patients now under their beds. So what does a patient do? When he's hooked up to a ventilator and has a tracheostomy, he can't get under his bed. So the patients who could get under the bed, you didn't have to tell them. They knew what was happening. They were under the bed, and we grabbed their mattress and threw it on top of the patients who couldn't get under their beds. This was all the protection that we had. Now, I want you to think about this. We are women doing this. We're taking care of the men. We're protecting them. And so the myth and the stereotype has been like, oh, women can't go into the war zone or be in a combat zone because all the men will be taking care of the women, and the men won't get their jobs done because they'll be taking care of these poor wilting violets women who need the men to take care of. No, that wasn't happening. Army nurses do their job, and we were the ones that went under the bed last. And there was only one other lieutenant with me, and then we had 4 medics. And our job was to protect those patients and take care of ourselves last. And after we had them all, and then they're pulling out their IVs and they're pulling out their bloodlines, right? Because they're getting under the bed, and then their IVs come crashing down. So I was checking bloodlines, making sure that the blood was still connected, IVs were connected, and after I'd made the assessment that my patients were all as safe as, there was no safety, even in a hospital bed. So, but the little girl who had been burned by napalm and had a circumferential burn around her whole body, and her village had been burned, her parents had disappeared, the medics brought her into our hospital. She was all by herself, and she was in a crib. And this little girl was so terrified because of the sounds, because it reminded her, I'm sure, of when her village was napalmed. She was screaming. And she screamed, and she didn't stop screaming. So now think about this. We're hearing all these helicopters overhead. We're hearing the rockets and mortars and the thuds and shrapnel flying around. And now we hear this little girl screaming. So when I describe Vietnam, I say it was a hallucination. My experience in Vietnam was so surreal. It was like I couldn't make this up. This was like a bad dream, but it was really happening. And so there wasn't anything I could do for that little girl. I couldn't put a mattress on top of her. She was burned all the way around her body. Her hands were not burned. So I took her hand and I crawled under her crib, and now I'm finally in protection under a crib. And the other lieutenant, Rosemary Burke, she's under some bed somewhere in the other end of the unit. And I just held that little girl's hand. And she screamed and she screamed and she screamed and she screamed herself to death. She did not live. We didn't expect her to live, but what a terrible way to die. And so we get the siren, that's all clear. Our guys, our weaponry has driven the enemy back, and now it's quiet, and now we clean up. And that's just one night in Vietnam, just one. And I can tell you a lot more, but we don't have time. But it's